Welcome back to Face to Face. We're here at the United Nations on the start of the Economic and Social Council meeting. The theme of this year is on productive capacities and decent work for poverty reduction. I am joined now by Jose Manuel Salazar. He is the Executive Director of Employment Sector for the International Labour Organization. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think maybe the first question I'd like to ask you is that, we hear the word decent jobs, good jobs. What actually makes a decent job or a job of a good quality?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question, actually. And as you know, the ILO has a quite precise response to it. In fact, the ILO has been very much stressing what this decent work is and what kind of floor that puts to, in terms of conditions. I think the place to start is the definition that the ILO has, which is a definition basically that says that it's productive employment in conditions of human dignity, of equity, and dignity for people. So the central aspect of the definition is that there is a material dimension and there are also non-material dimensions. The material dimension has to do with productivity. So let's say if to link it to the poverty lines, for instance, if you're earning less than $1 or $2 per day, then obviously your income keeps you in poverty. That is not decent work for the ILO. So there's a level of material well-being, there's a level of income, which is very much part of the definition, and obviously extreme poverty or a poverty situation for the family is not decent work. But it doesn't stop there, and this is the traditional, and this is the revolutionary aspect of the concept of decent work, that goes beyond the income dimension, and it goes into the dignity, the feeling of self-respect, of appreciation in the community, peace in the community and harmony, and how do you feel about yourself with the working conditions, etc. Of course, non-discrimination is also part of it. So this is where it takes us directly to the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work of 1998 that defines several basic rights: no forced labor, no child labor, non-discrimination, and freedom of association and collective bargaining. So, in other words, if you are a child laborer, that is not decent work. It's unacceptable work for the ILO. If you are in a condition of forced labor, it is also unacceptable as decent work. And if in some way you are discriminated against and so on at the workplace, that is also non-decent work. And if you don't have a right for freedom of association. So this, you can argue that puts a floor to what decent work is. This is a tremendous contribution. We know that there is a lot of issues, a lot of problems in many places. This is a fundamental threshold that the ILO puts and that has become very, very powerful and that has been integrated, including in this meeting, of the ECOSOC and embraced by many, many countries. But there is also the aspect of to what extent this is a universal metric. Is there some relativity to it? Which one can see, in a way as a second part, because we have many discussions and others say, well, you have to be pragmatic if working in a free trade zone, even if it's not the perfect job, but it's better than the alternative, then is that decent work or not? So I think you have to be uncompromising in terms of the labor rights, and this is a rights-based approach. And in that sense, you cannot really accept conditions of forced labor or child labor or discrimination. And the ILO has many ways of fighting against that, of contributing with governments against it, and so on. But on the other hand, on certain aspects of income or others, yes, you have to also be pragmatic, because this is to some extent, of course, related to the level of development.
And that's, I think that's the key point. Do countries have to wait until they develop economically before the rights-based approach can be respected, or can it be done in tandem?
Well, it has to be done in tandem, but in practice, if you are these developed countries, if you are developing countries, we know that situations are very complex, very mixed, and of course, if only 10% of your economy is a formal sector and the rest is informality, or 60% or 50 or 40, you have to be pragmatic. That it means that the laws can only apply to the formal aspect of it, and then there are also institutional limitations in terms of labor inspection, in terms of the capacity of the state institutions in charge of this to enforce. That doesn't mean accepting, but then you have to put all the emphasis in generating jobs, in investment, and this is where we get into the employment agenda, into the growth agenda, into the development agenda of countries, because the concept of decent work is both things. It's work in the first place and then the decency. So you have to really answer the questions, where are the jobs going to come from? Where is the work going to come from? It comes from the private sector mostly. It comes from investment. It comes from entrepreneurship. It comes from good skills and education of people. So these are the key ingredients of the employment agenda of the ILO.
Excellent. Now, when we're looking at the economic crisis and the recovery period, which is, I don't think is, as most people feel, has come as quickly as they would like it to be. What are the macroeconomic policies that can be put in place, not only to address this current economic financial crisis, but can also ensure that jobs of good quality are being created, not just the low-level jobs with very little benefit? So what macroeconomic policies, and how important are they?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked the question. The link with macroeconomics has been and continues to be discussed in the ILO and, of course, in the world. I think one of the starting point here is that the crisis showed that a macroeconomic shock, a financial shock, could be devastating for the labor market. Somehow, after the Second World War and the last 40 years and the boom of the 90s and even in this decade, particularly in developed countries, the world and even many economies had forgotten how important macroeconomics is, because we were all used to somehow aggregate demand being there at the right level, sometimes even more than the right level, sometimes feeding into bubbles or asset bubbles or in housing or in others. So we had forgotten how important it was, and actually we ourselves in the ILO were working very much with an emphasis on the so-called supply side, on the skills, on the education, on the entrepreneurship issues, on sustainable enterprises. And suddenly comes this tremendous financial crisis, and it reminds everybody that a financial shock could be even worse than a trade shock, than even globalization that everybody was so worried about, about trade and opening up trade and trade liberalization. That was the debate in the 90s and the early last decade. And suddenly we realized that the business cycle could be tremendous in this sense, and so it has all sorts of implications on the labor market. We know that the level of unemployment has shot up and it has not recovered. We know that long-term unemployment has increased tremendously. We know, and we have documented, we just published the latest report of the global employment trends, that short-term contracts, temporary jobs have increased tremendously, particularly in the developed world, in the developed countries, but also in some developing countries. And of course, we know that what we knew before the crisis, all the tremendous problem of underemployment in developing countries. So this is why having the right macro policies and to have a strong recovery is so crucial. The world is hurting very much, particularly the developed countries are hurting in a new way. The developing countries were hurting before the crisis, as Mr. Somavia says, but it is now the developed countries. And here is where you have a very difficult debate on macroeconomics. Part of it is the austerity versus stimulus. It's a bit simplistic. I think it's more complex. There is a whole sequence of events that have made issues very complicated. In some countries, of course, it was a financial banking crisis. Many of the fiscal deficits in some countries, it is because of the bailouts or the impact of the recession. So what in the ILO we have been saying, and I'll use that, if you have the fiscal space as a country, you have to use it to the maximum at the national level. And also, secondly, that it is extremely important to have international policy coordination, because we live in a very interdependent world, a very open economy, so fiscal stimulus in one country doesn't work. It has to be coordinated stimulus. We know that there was a first phase of the crisis where that policy worked. It avoided much worse outcomes. But then there was a relapse into too strong austerity in many places, and I think the last G20 meeting recognized that the world has to go back, and particularly the developed countries, to more coordination, to rescue the financial system, but at the same time put in disciplines in what has been a sector very much disconnected from the real economy and a little bit out of control and distorted. So a lot of many complex issues of macroeconomics, but the point is perhaps to finalize that we are in a kind of post-1930s moment in which suddenly there's again the Keynesian moment. Macroeconomics is crucial for employment. It's not the only element, but you can do a lot of things in the supply side, but if the macro framework is not correct, then you are not going to have good results.
You mentioned the G20, and the G20 again has reiterated how important it is to put jobs at the center of this growth. They spoke about this before in Pittsburgh, and I think now they've reiterated again. What are some of the very practical steps they can take, 3 or 4 policy measures that can actually move forward not only the recovery, but also the creation of decent work?
Yes. Well, I think in a way in the political discourse and in the documents, it has been said. I mean, there is nothing that we don't really know. I mean, the difficulty here is the political will to do it and the capacity to coordinate this internationally. But it is a job-centered agenda is an agenda around growth. So it is important that the austerity, if you look at the situation, the basic situation is consumers in several countries are highly indebted. They are deleveraging, so the consumption is not as high as it used to be. At the same time, investment is not there because of all the uncertainties. So if you have these 2 major engines of growth, which is consumption and investment at a low level, what you have in the medium term is what is the role of the state. And if the state, rather than spending or allowing tax facilitation policies, it is also in austerity, then it's a vicious circle. All the 3 major horses, if you like, that should pull an economy into dynamism, they're all pulling backwards. So this was the basic Keynesian insight, that when you have a downturn in consumption and in investment, the government can step in and make a big difference and try to break the vicious circle. So this continues to be a great truth. Now the question is, what is the fiscal space and to what extent you can really coordinate this? Now this is the talk for the developed countries, but one has to recognize that we have a very heterogeneous situation. Many countries around the world are not in crisis. We have high growth in the East. We have some very good growth in Latin America, which in fact is linked to the Eastern growth, but a lot of it is a question mark. Is it sustainable? It is based on primary commodities, high prices, high demand from China and so on. But the world is very interconnected, and the bad news is that the IMF and OECD have been revising downwards the growth projections, which shows that even China's growth is to some extent linked, of course, to the growth in Europe and in the United States. So the key is that there is international policy coordination for a growth-oriented approach. It is key also to really repair the financial system. There is a lot of uncertainties in this moment coming from still the banking situation, now linked also with sovereign debt issues. And I think, as Director General of the ILO is saying and characterizing and said in the speech this morning, the world is at a crossroads, at a turning point, and there is a lot. Kind of the old order is broken. There's a lot of policy rethink, but it is not clear how the governance and the political commitments and the multilateral system can really respond in an effective way. And I think this is a crucial moment, how the politicians and the governments can give the confidence that the policies are going to work, and this is crucial for financial markets, and most of all this is crucial for the people that are suffering and hurting because of the jobs crisis and the high levels of unemployment at the moment.
And I think that's quite important, because when we look at the economy, most people are not working in offices, people are in informality. How can we help people migrate from an informal economy or the informal sector into the formal economy? And what is the importance of doing that?
Yes. Well, look, I think here it is important. It is very difficult to talk about informality in general terms, because the situation of countries is drastically different. So I would favor to see this depending on the level of development. So if we talk about the bottom billion, if you like, and the least developed countries, these are countries that have informal sectors which are 80%, 90% of the economy. Tiny, small, formal sectors. So there is a very particular set of challenges there, which is really the challenge of development. So you have to recognize that in those countries, informality is very much a structural phenomenon. Really the big solution there, this is not a matter of regulations, this is not a matter of just a bit of institutional policy here and there. It is the structural challenge of development. So what those countries need to really reduce informality, first of all, you have to recognize that even in the best of scenarios, it will take many years. And you will need high and sustained growth of investments. You need interventions to promote the enabling environment for business, so you really have high rates of investment. You need entrepreneurship. A lot of the people in the informal economy in those countries could be very good entrepreneurs, but you need the facilitation, the promotion, the skills, the ease of doing business for them. You need also years of investment in education and skills. So the public policies in education and skills is absolutely essential. So this is the LDCs. Now you go to the middle income countries, even in middle income countries, even in countries like Brazil and so on, informality is 20, 25%, 30% in other cases, in many countries in Latin America. So it is much smaller, but it is very chronic as well. Same answer, you need sustained growth, but you need entrepreneurship, you need education and skills. But there is a debate, and that in Latin America is very clear. And some institutions have said, well, informality is a choice. If you make it very costly in terms of regulations, then entrepreneurs choose to be informal because you have to pay too high taxes or you have too high regulations. We have done a lot of research on this in the ILO and all institutions. And our bottom line, if you like, on this is that, yes, regulations can make a difference. Yes, they are important. Yes, it is crucial to simplify some of these regulations and to reduce the cost, including sometimes on the labor laws. But this is important at the margin. Ultimately, informality is a structural problem, and ultimately you need the entrepreneurship, you need the growth, you need the skills. But this is not to reduce the importance that regulations must have. And there is also the legal kind of inspection, the implementation. Strengthening the labor inspection is important, making campaigns so that people are aware of their rights, organizing the micro entrepreneurs, unfortunately, and this is part of the role of the employers' organizations. For instance, many employers' organizations are taking steps to integrate the micro entrepreneurs, the small entrepreneurs, and not just the large ones. This is crucial because without organization, you cannot really implement programs and so on, and you can do awareness campaigns, and then you can organize technical cooperation and mentoring, entrepreneurship mentoring and so on through better organized organizations of micro entrepreneurs. So there's a whole set of policies to reduce informality. There is no magic bullet, but we have learned a lot of lessons, and I think it is not a secret what needs to be done. The difficulty, as with the bigger issues we were talking of macroeconomics and the G20 before, is really the political will and the political conditions so that you have a common vision and that the different stakeholders and key players in society really agree on the way forward.
And I'm glad you're ending on that point because we are running out a bit of time. I could talk for another day and a half on this subject matter. Just maybe to mention very quickly, you mentioned about the political will. Recently, under your leadership, the call to action on youth employment has been implemented or has been agreed by the ILO. I mean, what would you say to the policymakers out there and others regarding youth employment, this idea about the political will is necessary and putting in the right measures? I mean, what are the key message you want to get across to those people?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. The key message I would like to get across is, first of all, a strong invitation for all policymakers and for researchers to look at this document that came out of the International Labour Conference of the ILO now in June. It's called a call for action for the youth employment crisis. It's a very powerful document, not just as a statement of the urgency of the situation, of the moral imperative to act urgently because of the situation of so many young people that even we're talking about the possibility of a lost generation or a generation scarred by lack of opportunities with long-term implications through their lifetimes. But it contains a series of principles, very good practice principles and orientations to put in place good, solid, well-tested policies to promote youth employment, and it contains a portfolio of policies in 5 major areas. So I would say if you are discussing at the national level in any country what else you need to do, how to improve the policies, this is a very good document to serve as a blueprint for a conversation for the areas in which one has to come together in terms of policies and implementation. And of course, in the ILO and other institutions, we are very committed and we have many tools and instruments. But it is time for action indeed on youth employment. It is an unbearable cost for society with very strong risks if we let this situation continue.
Jose Manuel, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your time today. As we hear, youth employment is a major issue that we need to address. The responses are known. How do we do that? How do we put that forward? I think that's the major test for political leaders today. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back to you in just a moment. Thank you.